Are we on now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that. My name is David Mantik. I received a PhD in physics from the University of Wisconsin in the 1960s, after which I completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. I then went on to teach physics at the University of Michigan for several years, and from there I entered the medical school at the University of Michigan, graduating in 1976. After completing a residency at the Los Angeles County, I joined the faculty at Loma Linda University Medical School and became director of the residency training program. Following several years there, I entered private practice and joined the Peter Lake Center in Rancho Mirage, California. And I am currently now working again at Loma Linda University, working on the proton therapy project in treatment of cancer patients.
Great. Okay. Let's start off. Okay. Well, let's start off with talking about fake evidence. What are the first instances in history, or not even the first, or what are some examples in history of where evidence, physical evidence, has been altered?
Well, if you look at photographic evidence, this was done in Hollywood, of course, in the early days of the film industry. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned this in our book, Assassination Science, edited by Jim Fetzer. In my chapter on the Zapruder film, I specifically mentioned that photographic alteration actually began before the Civil War, in the very earliest days of photography. And if you look at some of the earliest Hollywood movies, you can see the special effects people are already active. And I mentioned the great train robbery in there as one example. Now, if you're talking about deliberate deception in the alteration of history, the Soviet Union is, of course, one of the greatest examples of that. And we have a book that's just been published that shows many, many black and white pictures of alteration. Some are pretty obvious, and the overall impression is one of remarkable humor from our perspective today at how much of this went on. And the book is entitled, what is it? Okay. The book is entitled The Commissar Vanishes, and it includes some of the most famous names in Soviet history in the 20th century.
Okay, do you want to go through and you can I'm gonna later, film close-ups of them, but you can just look through them and
Well, this is probably pretty good place.
Okay.
On the back of the dust jacket is a rather funny example. This is obviously not deception, since anyone can tell that this has been altered, but it shows to what lengths they went to just obliterate faces. And on the front of the dust jacket, we do encounter deception in these paired photographs. In this one, you can see 4 figures, but in the paired photograph adjacent, you can see that one figure has been removed. And these figures contain some of the leading names in Soviet history, of course, as you can tell. And in the paired photos at the bottom, we see that you go from 2 heads here to 1 here. And this theme recurs throughout this book in many, many photographs.
Okay. Did you want to open up and show specific?
Yeah, let's find another one here. Here's another pair of photographs, and when you compare these, you can see that we've lost one figure in going from this pair to this pair. Nalchenko has disappeared. The second photograph was taken in 1939, and by that time he was no longer an honorable man in their opinion, and so was removed from the photo.
Okay.
Here's another interesting pair. In this photo, here, this one, we can see a large number of people, but when this is compared to the adjacent pair, the fellow who had been here has been cropped out. The two men who had been on the other side are now airbrushed out. And this fellow who appeared over the woman's head is gone. He's airbrushed out. And this fellow who had been here is also airbrushed out. So we've lost 5 individuals. This fellow with the hat on is Stalin. And in a later version, Stalin is the only one who remains in this photo.
Okay. Now for the rest of this too, you can just talk to me.
Yeah, rather than the camera.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
And let's go into the X-rays. Actually, I kind of like to do this sort of in a story fashion.
Okay.
Similar to the way you write in your book.
Well, I'll bring the kids in then.
Yeah. Talk about how your first
Sure.
experiences with the X-rays, and we'll do
Sure.
the same thing with the film.
Okay.
Okay. So
Are we on? Yeah.
we're
Okay.
ready.
Well, I first became interested in this case at about the time that Oliver Stone's movie came out. My wife wanted to go to see it, and I did too, but I hesitated because I didn't want to be brainwashed. And so I decided to try to find out on my own what had happened in 1963. And after I'd read about 5, 6, or 7 books, I began sensing that there was something not quite right about this case, and that the Warren Commission's conclusions didn't seem to fit with the data that we had, especially the medical and scientific data. And I was especially interested in the X-rays, because it seemed to me that they had not been analyzed sufficiently enough, and that was an area that I might be able to contribute something new. So I remember one morning I was at our breakfast table reading David Lifton's best-selling book, Best Evidence, and I was looking at the black and white prints of the skull X-rays in there. There is both a view from the front, called the anterior-posterior, or AP view, and a view from the side, called the lateral view. And I was struck by 2 things in particular. On the frontal view, there is a metal-like object, which most people have interpreted as a bullet fragment. It's 6.5 millimeters in diameter, suggesting that it came from a 6.5 millimeter weapon of some sort. And it has always been interpreted as lying at the back of the skull. And we know that Oswald has been accused of firing this shot with a 6.5 millimeter weapon, so it seemed especially neat that this object might fit with Oswald, because Oswald was supposedly positioned behind Kennedy, so that this object might very well lie at the back of the head rather than the front. The second thing that caught my attention was on the lateral X-ray, the one taken from the side, which showed a very large white area at the back of the head behind the ear. I'd never seen any X-rays like this before, and so I was puzzled by this. So as the months and years went by, I investigated these areas further, and I made several trips to the National Archives to examine the actual X-rays that are housed there. And while there, I made some measurements on them. What I did was use a very simple device called an optical densitometer to measure how much light is transmitted through different parts of the X-ray. And the white area looked, even on the real X-rays, looked too white. And when I took measurements of it, it also came out that way. Now, the densest bone in the human body is the bone around the ear. And when I compared the transparency on the X-ray around the ear to the transparency in this large white area, they were very similar, which was really quite remarkable. It suggested that there was almost solid bone at the back of Kennedy's head behind the ear from left to right, which is, of course, ridiculous because we know it's mostly brain. So that was the first oddity that caught my eye. The second one had to do with that bullet fragment that we saw on the frontal X-ray. Now, historically, the whole purpose of taking X-rays at the autopsy was to find bullet fragments or bullets and remove them. That was the sole purpose of taking X-rays at the autopsy. And yet, this most obvious fragment, and it is the most obvious one on the X-ray, was never discussed in any of the historical records. It was not removed. It is not in evidence, has never been in evidence. Its first appearance historically was when a subsequent government panel reviewed these X-rays. That's the first time that this object became publicly known. So this is a very, very curious state of affairs. So I'm sitting at the breakfast table looking at this object, and I'm still puzzled as to why they didn't remove it, why they didn't do something with it, at least comment on it. And I got an idea. I said, well, gee, I wonder if my kids can find it. Well, that's an interesting question because my son, Christopher, at the time was only 7. And so I called him over to my side of the table and I said, Christopher, here's the X-ray of Kennedy's skull. Can you find the bullet? And he looked at it for a very brief time, and he pointed right at this object, and he turned to me and he said, is that it? I said, yes, that's it. And then I had a 5-year-old daughter at that time who was sitting at the other end of the table and who hadn't seen what was going on. And so I said, well, this is getting interesting. Let's try Meredith. So I said, Meredith, come over here. Can you find the bullet? And she came over and she looked at it and she said, well, what's it supposed to look like? Very natural question. I said, well, it's supposed to be white. And she said, well, is that it? Pointing right at it. I said, yes, that's it. You got it. And so my 5-year-old and my 7-year-old children at that time were able to instantaneously almost identify this object that could not be seen by 3 qualified forensic pathologists, by 1 radiologist, and by dozens, literally dozens of other people there, including many medical personnel. None of them saw this object. It was not removed, and it's at the back of the skull where it's very easy to remove. Instead, what they removed was a much smaller piece of metal from the front of the head, just above the right eye, and another even smaller one close to it. And those are the only 2 pieces of metal that were ever removed from Kennedy's head. And this much, much larger, much more visible object was not removed. It appears nowhere in the historical record until years later. So the question is, well, what happened? How could that be? And there have been all sorts of amazing explanations as to why this unfolded like it did. Well, some people suggested that the doctors were so harassed that they simply overlooked it. That just doesn't make sense when you've got dozens of people looking for just such an object and it's so obvious. I mean, why didn't they just call in my 7-year-old son? He would have found it for him. That makes no sense. The other possibility that was raised was, well, maybe it fell off the skull before they could pull it off. But yet, why didn't they comment on seeing it on the X-rays? Because it's there, on the current X-rays at any rate. So that's a difficult one to accept as well. Furthermore, on the lateral X-ray, we can see where this object supposedly should lie at the back of the skull. So we see something, at least, on the frontal view, and we see something on the lateral view that seems to correlate as if it is indeed the same object. So even if it fell off, then why do we see it on both views, and why didn't they say something? So there's really no satisfactory answer for this historical conundrum. And then I started wondering about whether I could sort this out. And the only thing I could think of that made sense was that someone had actually altered the X-rays after the autopsy. That would make sense, and it would explain why this object appears later in the record, and everything would fall into place. But this was a new sort of venture for me. I had never asked that sort of question before, and I think historically no one else had either. So that was my first question. How would you go about altering an X-ray? And I found that it wasn't too difficult to do that, but you can't use X-rays to alter an X-ray. And that's where the early government panels apparently had gotten hung up. They had forgotten that an X-ray actually is made by light or near visible light. It's not the X-ray beam itself that exposes the X-ray. What happens instead is that the X-ray is sandwiched between material that turns the X-ray into light or near visible light. And it's that light that exposes the X-ray film, not so much the X-ray beam. And back in those days, as we do now, it's very easy to copy X-rays. And we don't use X-rays to copy X-ray films. In order to copy X-rays, we simply go into a photographic darkroom, and we put the film on a light box. And it's the light that is used to copy the X-ray film. And so that technique was available decades and decades ago and was in widespread use, certainly in the 60s and 50s and probably before that. In fact, there's a book that was published on X-ray techniques in 1961, and it describes in some detail how to make copies of X-ray film using standard X-ray film. They didn't have any special copying film. They just used regular X-ray film. And you had to pre-expose it to light to just the right amount to make it work as a copy or duplicating film. And so that was in widespread use, and those recipes were published in that book in 1961. And the author even included, side by side, a copy of an original X-ray along with, I should say, the original X-ray along with a copy. And his point was that the technique was so good you couldn't tell them apart. And in the book, I couldn't tell them apart either. They looked identical. So it was possible then, and it was in widespread use, to make copies of X-rays like this. And they were excellent copies. So we know this historically. How does that apply? How would you then alter an X-ray? Well, it's really very simple. Instead of doing a single exposure during the copying process, what if you did a double exposure before you processed the film? What would you do the second time to alter the original? Well, suppose you cut out a hole in a piece of paper or cardboard, and with your second exposure, just exposed that hole. What would you see then on the copy film? Well, that hole would show up on the copy film because you gave it more exposure, and it would appear more transparent or whiter because it had gotten more light. So wherever you put that hole in the cardboard over the film that was over the duplicate film, you'd have a wider area. And you can make this any size or shape you want. You could give it any exposure you wanted, and it's absolutely trivial. I was able to do this almost literally in a few seconds in the darkroom, and I came out with the duplicate film looking just like the original, except for this white area that I had overexposed. And I could put this anywhere. It takes a little care to put it exactly where you want, but there's no reason why you can't do it. And so it was obvious to me that it would have been very simple to put a bullet-like fragment, transparent, anywhere that you liked on the film. But when I tried to do this with standard X-ray films rather than our current duplicate films, I ran into a problem. It turned out that the film, the copy film, turned out to be greenish cast, so it was obviously not duplicating well. And I didn't know what to do about this. Until one evening I called a good friend of mine in radiology and I said, do you have any old medical physics books that might tell us how they duplicated film back in the 60s? And he called me back a little later that night, and he told me something that was absolutely critical in understanding this. He said that in the mid-60s, the manufacturers of X-ray film had begun adding a dye to the films so that they could no longer be used for copying X-rays. And that explained, to my satisfaction, why my results had turned out to be greenish. So before the mid-60s, this wouldn't have happened. If I had done the experiment before the mid-60s, I would have been able to reproduce gorgeous, realistic X-rays, altered, putting bullet fragments or whitish areas wherever I wanted. But I could no longer do that on the current films because they contain these dyes. So in principle then, we were able to explain this. Well, I ran into some other problems too, which I should probably not go into in technical detail. Those are all discussed in our book, Assassination Science, in my chapter on the X-rays. But eventually it turned out that all the obstacles were overcome, and it was, in fact, remarkably easy to make copies of X-ray film that had the image on both sides of the emulsion that were of quality almost as good as the original, so that one could not tell them apart visibly. And you could place whitish areas in particular wherever you wanted. Or you could put darker areas too. Instead of using a white hole on your first exposure, you could put something that would obstruct light, so you could produce a darkened area as well. So all of these techniques were readily available and actually easy to do. And so the question was, did this actually happen? Is this really what happened? Well, now, since the release in late July 1998 of the many of the medical records from the Assassination Records Review Board, we have historical support for this very concept. John Ebersol, who was the radiologist at the autopsy, according to these records, was called to the White House on the morning after the assassination. He was called to the Secret Service people, and after his discussion with them, he went directly back to the radiology department at the Bethesda Naval Medical Center where the autopsy was done. And immediately he began issuing an order, or orders, to his technologist, Gerald Custer, to take x-rays of pieces of skull, bullets, bullet fragments, and bullet fragments taped to skull or skull fragments. And Custer was told that the reason for this exercise was so that they could obtain a bust of John F. Kennedy. Of course, none of this makes any sense. Well, I've never heard of anyone using an X-ray in order to make a bust in the first place. And if they really had wanted to use one, there was a pre-mortem X-ray that was intact and not just exploded to bits like we had here. So that was obvious nonsense. And I think the obvious conclusion is that immediately Ebersol was trying to determine a way to alter the X-ray, taking X-rays of bullets or fragments, skull fragments, and tape together. That's the only thing that makes sense, that he was attempting to do that. I suspect at that moment he hadn't realized how simply this could be done, as I've already explained, and it was only after some thought that he realized how to do this in a much easier way. Now, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Ebersol only a few months before he died. On the first occasion, he actually had called me in response to a letter I had written to him, and we talked for a fair amount of time. And I was surprised at some of the things he said that seemed to support a view of conspiracy, although he himself held very strongly to a single gunman, Oswald did it belief. Then I think that we had talked about speaking again on the phone, and I called him several months later, and this time the conversation was recorded. It had not been recorded the first time, and so we have that recording in existence today. He, at this point, was very reluctant. It seemed that his opinion had changed remarkably. The first time he had been very open and willing to talk, but now he was extremely reluctant, as if he had changed his mind about talking about this. Nonetheless, he did reluctantly go on to address a number of issues. But when I came to talking about this 6.5 millimeter object, the conversation just immediately ground to a halt and was never resumed. His response was, well, you know, I'm a very sick man. I have brain metastases from lung cancer, and I'm terminal, and I suspect all that was true, because he did die very shortly afterwards. And he never again discussed with me, and I think with anyone else, any particulars about these x-rays. But it was striking to me that the moment I approached that particular issue, that's the moment when the whole conversation stopped. So we never got any very specific information from Dr. Ebersol about that. And that's very odd. Everything will break.
Okay. And okay. So you're going to explain that.
So we're on?
Process.
We're on, okay.
Yes, we're on.
At this point, I had not yet proved that the 6.5 millimeter object had been added to the X-ray. So far, it is speculation based on good historical information. But as I was able to take this much farther with measurements that I made on the actual X-rays. And these measurements occurred over several different visits to the National Archives. And during that process, I took hundreds of data points on these X-rays and extremely close data points on this 6.5 millimeter object, spaced at intervals of 1/10 of a millimeter. And the conclusions were consistent with what we had expected, that this object indeed had been added to the X-ray. And the reasons for thinking this are as follows. On the frontal X-ray, we can compare the transparency of this 6.5 millimeter object to the transparency over the teeth. And the teeth are interesting because Kennedy had a great number of amalgams in his teeth. Virtually all of his molars were almost completely filled with amalgams, which were at that time about half mercury and half silver. So these are very dense and heavy metals. And as expected, they were very easy to see on the X-rays. When looking at the frontal X-ray, one is looking through then an array, one on top of another, like dominoes piled up, of 4 or 5 amalgams in a row. And so the X-ray is actually going successively through those. And naturally, therefore, this area looks very transparent, as metal typically does on an X-ray. And so I could compare with my eye, first of all, the transparency of the teeth on the frontal view to the transparency of this 6.5 millimeter metal object, presumably containing lead. And it seemed to me, just looking at it with my eye, that there was more metal in the 6.5 millimeter object from front to back than in all of these dental fillings piled up on top of one another. And that made no sense, because we have here almost 10 millimeters or more, probably more, of mercury silver through which the X-rays have to pass. And then I could easily confirm that, of course, with the optical density measurements, and they said the same thing. What they're telling us is quite remarkable, that there's more metal front to back in that so-called metallic object than in all of these dental fillings piled up on top of one another. And that's ridiculous, because on the lateral X-ray we can actually see that this same object, corresponding to the 6.5 millimeter entity on the frontal X-ray, we can see that it's only a few millimeters from front to back. And we can see that those dental amalgams are really long. So this was preposterous. It just made no sense at all. So that was the first paradox, and one of the most obvious ones here. On the other hand, if this 6.5 millimeter object had been added as I suggested, say by cutting out a piece of cardboard, a hole just that size and shape, then you could make that object as transparent as you wanted just by controlling the time of the light exposure. So you can make it look like an extremely long piece of metal from front to back. So that all fit perfectly well.
Let me just adjust this, just so you don't bump it with your hands, because if
you want it up higher.
Just
okay.
If you hit it too much, you get a scratchy sound.
Yeah. Okay.
Set up a little higher. Yeah, this looks great.
Okay.
Okay, continue.
All right. The second line of evidence that supported the same conclusion is this. At the 4 to 6 o'clock position in this 6.5 millimeter object, it looks like there's a bite that's been taken out, a very smooth bite. But clearly there's less metal here. So it's natural then to ask, well, if you look at this supposedly same object on the lateral view, do you see less metal at the bottom than you see at the middle? You should, if the view on the front is telling us the right story. So I took the lateral X-ray and looked at the bottom of this object and compared it to the middle of the object. And I'm talking now about taking the optical density measurements to determine just how much metal was there. And what I found was just the opposite. At the bottom, where I should have found less metal, I actually found more metal than at the center. So even though that bite was taken out, the actual numbers that I was measuring was suggesting that wasn't true. And then at one moment I remember taking my glasses off, because at that time I was very nearsighted and I could see things close up extremely well. And I remember being instantaneously struck that I was seeing pieces of metal inside this supposed piece of metal. So it was like a superposition of images. And that's exactly what you would expect if this process had been used. And this process is discussed in well-known cinematography books when an image is superimposed. It looks like you're seeing through one object to another object. And I realized that's what was happening. I could actually see that there was an authentic piece of metal on one side of this circular type object. And that was almost certainly what was there originally. In other words, they had superimposed this roundish 6.5 millimeter object right on top of an original piece of metal that was much smaller, much smaller. And that then explained why I could see something on the lateral view that was probably also authentic, because they had done it in just the right place. And when I looked closely at the authentic piece of metal, I could see that indeed it was thicker at the bottom than it was at the middle. And that explained why my measurements on the lateral X-ray were what they were. Everything fit. Absolutely everything fit at once. I did one more thing when I got back home. Someone had given me a 6.5 millimeter bullet, Mantik JFK, and I just sawed off a piece, a cross-section like a piece of sausage, of about the same size that I saw on the X-ray. And I also sawed out a little bite, just like we saw on there. I put that on a skull, a real human skull, and I X-rayed it, and it looks very, very much like the autopsy X-ray. And then I did the optical density measurements on that. And no surprise, they're totally inconsistent with the Kennedy autopsy X-rays. In particular, a real piece of metal of that size looks very, very different from what we see on the autopsy X-rays. In particular, on the lateral X-ray, when I took the measurements, on a real bullet you are looking through 6.5 millimeters of mostly lead, and it looks very white. Whereas on the autopsy Kennedy X-rays, when you look at the lateral X-ray, and you look at that piece of metal that was originally there, it's very hard to see in prints in books because there's very little metal from left to right. On the actual X-rays you can see it, but it's not nearly as transparent as it was on my X-rays. And the reason is obvious, because the original piece of metal was much smaller, much thinner. So if that had really been a 6.5 millimeter piece of metal, cross-section of a bullet, it would have been real easy to see on the lateral, but it wasn't. And so, in fact, I developed 8 different lines of argument, some of which I've not even mentioned here, all of which were consistent with this proposal, both qualitatively and quantitatively, with actual measurements. And they all pointed in the same direction, all consistent with the notion that this frontal X-ray with the 6.5 millimeter object on it was not authentic. They had simply added that 6.5 millimeter object so that it could be tied to Oswald, and it was at the back of the skull, which was very fortunate.
What excuses, excuses, have they given for this anomaly?
The only intelligent response I've seen so far has come from Larry Sturtevant, who was in fact the ballistics expert for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And Sturtevant testified extensively for this committee, and he was accepted readily by them as a top ballistics expert. In communications in the past 6 to 12 months, Sturtevant has suggested that this 6.5 millimeter object is not a bullet fragment. In fact, he's quite adamant about it. He says there's no way that this can be an authentic piece of a bullet. But he's proposed some other possibilities for it. But let me emphasize first why he is quite adamant that it cannot be a piece of bullet fragment. He says that in all of his experience in ballistics, he has never seen a cross-section of a bullet like this embed itself at the back of the skull near a supposed entrance wound. That simply doesn't happen. And we have the word of other experts as well. No one has ever contradicted that kind of statement. The other anomaly here is that the location at the back of the skull of this object is at least 1 centimeter below the supposed entrance hole. So not only does something never heard of have to happen. This object has to be cut out literally of the inside of a bullet and then stay on the back of the skull. But it has to, in addition, migrate 1 centimeter inferiorly and stay there. So at every step of this process, one encounters astronomical improbabilities. And Sturtevant is recognizing this, and he's saying that whatever this is, it cannot be a bullet. So the top ballistics expert for the House Select Committee on Assassinations now has stated that this cannot be a bullet fragment. And this contradicts the whole history of this case and the position that was taken by the House Select Committee. I mean, basically, Sturtevant is disagreeing with the conclusions drawn by the committee that he testified for. So what is it then? Well, Sturtevant has suggested several possibilities, and these are, I think, to be taken as suggestions, as even he would probably say. One of his suggestions was that this object could have been caused by a chemical drop that fell at this site, causing overexposure at this location. And it's true that something like this, in principle, might be possible. But I think that the evidence that we have is really not consistent with that for several reasons. A drop would probably have rather irregular borders, whereas the borders on this object are remarkably sharp. Even where the bite is taken out, even there it's very sharp. And why would a drop form such a very clear-cut, almost geometric image? There's no splatter pattern, either around the borders or adjacent droplets separated slightly in space. We have nothing like that. But the most curious thing of all is this. Why would such a chemical drop form precisely over a pre-existing authentic piece of metal? What is the probability that such a drop, of all possible spots, or locations on this X-ray, would fall precisely over a pre-existing piece of metal? That seems just inconceivable to me.
No, and it also, didn't you say that it would have had to happen on both X-rays?
Yes, let's go to that next. Sturtevant has made a second suggestion as well, namely that there was indeed a stray piece of metal somewhere in the field of view of the X-ray beam that was caught on this film. If that were the case, where would it be? If not on the body, then perhaps it was on the film cassette itself. If it were on the film cassette, indeed, then it would be seen on the X-ray film when developed. But again, we have the same problem. Remember that we have both an AP and a lateral X-ray, and we see something there. I think that there was an authentic piece of metal fragment, a rather small one, few millimeters at most, on the back of JFK's head. That was really there. That was caught on the lateral X-ray. We still see it today. It looks authentic. It was also caught on the frontal X-ray, and we see it today, but only buried on one side of this 6.5 millimeter object. But I saw it with my naked eyes, and the measurements are consistent with that. So what would happen if there was now yet another piece of metal that Sturtevant is proposing lying on the X-ray cassette? Indeed, if it were just that size and shape, then of course it would show up on the image just the same way. It would have to have a bite taken out of it. But most peculiarly of all, again, that stray piece of metal would have to perfectly overlie the pre-existing authentic metal fragment on the back of JFK's skull. And we have the same improbability again. Why, of all these sites where this stray piece of metal could lie, would it happen to lie exactly over the pre-existing metal fragment? That's just too improbable to believe. Besides, if there really had been a piece of metal there on the cassette, don't you think someone would have noticed it when it slipped off and rattled to the floor? And if it really had been around, why don't we see it again on the lateral X-ray if it fell off or fell onto Kennedy's head? On the lateral X-ray, it's nowhere. It doesn't exist. So both of these proposals by Sturtevant are pure speculation with no experimental support and even, I would say, almost no theoretical support for them. And naturally, it's fair to look for alternative explanations of this object. but I think we have to deal with the facts here. We don't have any support for those proposals, whereas we have, as I've outlined in detail, both historical and scientific support for proposing that this object was added to the X-ray later, probably within a few days of the autopsy, if not even the Saturday after. We have one more important historical piece of information that should be added. Very shortly after the autopsy, Ebersol was called back to the White House again. Now, this is his second trip. On this second trip, he has shown the X-rays of the skull once more. And the story that Ebersol tells, which is well documented in the record, is a rather curious one. He's told that he's being asked for a magnification factor, that is, the magnification between the actual size of Kennedy's skull and what is seen on the X-rays. And there's a code called Aunt Margaret's skirt, a code phrase that's used so that he knows that this is the question he's being asked. And so apparently he goes back to the White House, and I believe it's at this occasion that he draws a pencil line on the X-rays. And the curious question is, what's this all about? I mean, this doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, nobody's really going to use this X-ray for a bust, so why is he there? What's the whole purpose of this thing? And so I think it's fair to speculate that he's being now shown the altered X-rays, and the authorities that be are wanting to know whether he's going to now officially accept these as the authentic, unaltered X-rays. They're trying to get a psychological reaction from Ebersol to see if he's going to stand by these. And we don't know, of course, what he said at that time, but historically, I think it's pretty clear that he has stood by them. He's never pointed the finger in any direction. So we have no other explanation for this strange second visit to the White House than this sort of speculation that he's basically being tested on whether he's going to affirm these as the real X-rays. Nothing else makes much sense.
Okay.
All right. Now, I had mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that there were two features of these X-rays that had caught my eye as being unusual. One was the 6.5 millimeter object seen only on the frontal view, and the second feature was the large white area seen on the lateral view of the skull X-ray. And this was indeed a large area, almost fist-sized, behind the ear. And I've mentioned before that it was so white or transparent that it almost looked as if the skull at that location was solid bone from side to side, which of course made no sense. And one quick way to check that out would be to go back again to the frontal view and look at that area to see if it did indeed look as if there was bone from left to right. And of course it doesn't. In fact, just the opposite. At that level in the X-ray, we can see that there are large black areas suggesting either very little tissue or just air. So there was a flagrant inconsistency immediately at that portion of the skull between the frontal view and the lateral view. And this was outside the range of my experience. And I later on confirmed this by looking at a fair number of skull X-rays of patients that had come through our department and measuring them, taking optical density measurements on them. And I never saw any other X-rays that were remotely like these lateral X-rays of Kennedy. The area behind the ear and all of these was much darker, more consistent with brain and not bone. And so to this date, we have no explanation no reasonable explanation for why this area should have looked so white or transparent. Except, of course, that it was also altered. My guess is this. After the folks involved with this process realized how easy it was to add white areas, they probably started playing around with the lateral view also and asking if they could enhance this in some way to support the official story that there was one assassin. And they probably did have a little difficulty here, because the Dallas doctors and most of the witnesses at the autopsy as well described the large hole in the head as being at the right rear. So on the X-ray, that area should have looked dark, as if tissue were missing, rather than white as we now have it. So if this darker area had been overexposed by a second exposure, then they could have eliminated this darker area at the back of the skull. Well, why was that important? Well, obviously a bullet coming in the front would tend to blow tissue out of the back and make it look black. And so that would make it look like there was a shot from the front. But if they could cover this up by overexposing the back of the head, then it would no longer look as if a lot of tissue were missing from the back, and one would no longer conclude that there had been a bullet from the front. So there was certainly strong incentive for wanting to alter the X-rays. And it does look like there is just a large white patch back here with fairly clear outlines, with fairly clear borders that's just been placed over this area on both the left lateral and the right lateral X-ray. Now, the other thing that's curious about the lateral X-ray is how very black it is at the front. At the front, we have another fist-sized area, only this time it's very black. It's so black, in fact, that there's almost nothing there. How do I know that? Well, it's very easy, because I can look at the air surrounding the skull on the X-ray and compare that blackness to the blackness here inside the skull, and there's very little difference. And I mean it at two levels. If you look at it first with the naked eye, there's very little difference. But even more importantly, when that is measured, when the transmission of light is measured through here, inside the skull, through the air outside, they're really close. Meaning that in a very large volume here at the front of the skull, both left and right sides, there's no brain there, or very little brain. And that's curious because the photographs of the brain clearly show that almost all the brain is present in the brain on both the left and the right side in front. So there's an enormous paradox as well that arose from this.
Okay. Do you want to, I'll give you a pen and I'll give you the lateral X-ray.
Right. Right, let's do that. Mm-hmm. Would it be better with this sleeve off, do you think?
Maybe, so it doesn't reflect so much light.
Yeah, let's just hold it like that. It's a smoother surface anyway.
Okay, good. That'll work. And just 1 second, just be careful of the microphone. Yeah, you don't. In fact, let me just fix this because it looks like.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, go ahead.
This is the lateral X-ray of Kennedy. It's the only lateral X-ray that includes the whole skull. The other lateral X-ray is not in the public record and actually is cut off at the critical posterior portion of the skull. So this is the one that's usually used. It's hard to see well on this view, but there is indeed a wider area that I'm outlining right now. It runs about like that. The borders are a little easier to see here, and may be visible here, right through here. But this whole area in the back is visibly and measurably wider. So it's quite a large area, and it overlies the area that the witnesses said was missing.
Okay. Now let me come in real tight.
Do you want me to do it again with the close-up?
Yeah, I'm coming in real tight. You just keep it exactly where you got it
Mm-hmm.
now. Okay, and let me focus on. Okay, now just trace that.
Do it again.
Just trace that again.
This large white area or transparent area at the back of the skull is located with these borders. And these borders along here in particular should be visible in this view, but it continues down this way, comes around like that. So that whole volume is extremely white or transparent on the X-ray.
Great.
And we have to do the same with the anterior X-ray, don't we?
Okay. You ready?
This is the frontal view of the skull, and this is the right eye socket here. This is the left eye socket, and this is the nose. This is the top of the skull, and you can see that on the right side a large area of the top of the skull has been either disrupted or is actually missing. And the very dark areas in here suggest a great deal of brain missing throughout here. Now the 6.5 millimeter object that I've been discussing is this one. And it's quite apparent at a glance that that is the most obvious piece of metal on the film. The next most obvious is this one, and this one was removed. This was well above the right eye, as you see here, actually above the right frontal sinus. That was removed, along with a smaller second piece of metal, which may have been that very tiny one. But this one is not commented on, nor is it removed. You can also see on closer inspection that there is a small bite taken out of it at the 4 to 6 o'clock position, down in there. It's not exactly circular because that bite is missing.
Okay. Go ahead.
This is taken from Assassination Science. Experts Speak Out on the Death of JFK, edited by James Fetzer. On page 159, we have printed a pre-mortem skull X-ray of John F. Kennedy, as shown here. And that large white area that I had mentioned before is really not evident. This looks more like a standard X-ray of a patient. So we have this really wonderful control for the autopsy X-rays built in right here with the X-ray taken of Kennedy before death. This was taken a number of years before he died, and I don't remember exactly what the reason for the taking of the X-ray was. But this appears in the public record of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So we have this remaining inconsistency then about this large white area, which is not seen in this view.
Okay, we're recording. First of all, I'm going to ask you why are the teeth cropped on those on the X-rays? Are there different X-rays that have teeth and those just don't?
There are no X-rays in the public record, or no copies of the X-rays in the public record that show the teeth. I believe this was done either at the direct request of the Kennedy family, or perhaps it was actually voluntarily done by the House Select Committee because they were sensitive about the Kennedy family wishes.
Okay, but where did you see the X-rays of the teeth that you talked about?
The House Select Committee did actually publish dental X-rays. They're in the public record. So you can actually attach them to the copies of the X-rays and you can complete the image if you want to. But they chose to do it separately.
Okay. Was there something that you looked up that you wanted to...
No, that's for later.
Okay. Okay, and then in that case, we'll start with the autopsy report. What did the autopsy report say about the nature of the head wounds?
Well, the three autopsy pathologists, James Humes, J.J. Boswell, and Pierre Fink, concluded that there had just been a single shot to the head fired from the rear. And they've always stood by that position. They saw the entrance wound at the back of the skull. And they based their observations and their conclusion on both what they saw in the scalp and what they saw in the skull. In the scalp, they actually saw a through-and-through hole in the scalp where they said the bullet had gone through. And that's obviously pretty good evidence. If you got a little hole in the scalp, that would fit very well. But more than that, they found evidence on the skull that corresponded spatially to the hole in the scalp. So they fit together in 3 dimensions. What they found on the skull, way in the back, on the right, just above the hairline, was beveling on the skull. There wasn't a hole in the skull, as best we can reconstruct what they've said. It wasn't like a hole in the bone like they had a hole in the scalp. Rather, there was a good deal of bone missing at the back of the skull. So they had a partial hole in the skull, whereas they had a complete hole in the scalp. At the partial hole in the skull, what they saw was beveling on the bone, meaning that it was beveled out more on the inside than on the outside. The hole was larger on the inside than on the outside. And that would be consistent with the bullet entering from the rear and then the hole enlarging as the bullet went through. So that told them that the bullet that passed through the back of the head actually entered from the rear and was going to the front. So that's basically their evidence for a shot from the rear into the skull.
What is the problem with using that to tying that to Oswald in the 6th floor?
There is a bit of a problem tying that evidence to Oswald. The fact is that you'd expect that shot to have come in a little higher on the skull. If Oswald was indeed in the 6th floor of the book depository building, and in the Zapruder film, the 8mm home movie of the assassination, you can see that Kennedy, at that moment, when he was supposedly hit by the shot, is leaning forward somewhat, and his head is rotated to the left a bit. If that shot came in really low on the back of the head, and it followed a nearly straight-line trajectory, you'd expect the shot to come out in his face somewhere, which of course it doesn't. So the point is that the shot seems to come in too low if the pathologists are right. It doesn't fit. It would fit much better with a gunman either at ground level or 1st floor, maybe 2nd floor. But 6th floor seems awfully high for the evidence that we have. So there's a serious problem with that. Several years later, when another government panel looked at the autopsy x-rays and photographs, they actually raised the entry site by 4 inches, 10 centimeters, placing it close to the colic area in the back of the head. And that would fit a lot better with a 6th floor shooter. But the main reason they raised it was because it was at that occasion that the 6.5mm so-called bullet fragment suddenly appears in the public record. That's the first occasion. That was the reason that they raised it up.
So I was just about to ask.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the bullet edge. What did the witnesses, particularly Dallas doctors, how did they describe Kennedy's head?
Well, none of the witnesses in Dallas saw or described any evidence for the location of a bullet entry hole at the back of the head. What they described at the back of the head was a large hole, say about 10 centimeters or 2.5 inches at least across, right at the back of the head, low in the back of the head, starting low in the back of the head and going up several inches. And it was all on the right side. And many doctors and other medical personnel described such a large hole at the back of the head. They were quite consistent in that. And that made them conclude that a bullet had exited at that site and therefore must have come in from the front somewhere.
What other evidence do we have that the back of the head was blown out? Because it's not what we see in the official autopsy photographs.
We have other evidence that it was the right rear of the head that was missing. At the examination at Bethesda Naval Medical Center by the pathologist, many other medical personnel saw that the same area was missing. This became very clear in their interviews by the House Select Committee in the late 70s. Many of these witnesses were asked to draw roughly and crudely the skull and the location of this large hole, and they were quite unanimous in placing it, again, at the right rear of the skull, starting just above the hairline. In fact, they were very consistent with the reports that we had gotten from Parkland Hospital in Dallas. In addition, the autopsy report itself describes a large hole at the top of the head and extending posteriorly into the occipital area, which is pretty low on the back of the head. So the official autopsy report is really not inconsistent with that. Furthermore, the pathologist at the autopsy, in conjunction with the medical illustrator, drew a very detailed sketch of the skull showing where this large hole was in the head. And in fact, it does extend into the occipital area, well into the rear of the head. So we have not only the official autopsy report, we have this sketch showing a large defect going well into the back of the head, plus supporting statements and diagrams of the many witnesses at Bethesda and at Parkland. Now here's the problem. We have no photograph which shows this hole. In spite of everything I've said, there is no photograph that shows that hole in the back of the head. Truly astonishing state of affairs. The photograph we do have of the back of the head shows a very shiny scalp, intact scalp, right here at the back of the head, intact until actually the top of the head. So this whole area back here in the photograph looks almost normal, almost as if it were freshly washed and cleaned with no evidence of trauma, certainly no hole. There is one photograph of the skull which shows a large hole, but it has never been oriented officially in an agreed upon manner. I think that one can make very powerful arguments based on the x-rays that this photograph of the skull is indeed a photograph of the right rear of the skull, and indeed there is a large hole there. But this has not reached the level of consensus yet. But that's my interpretation of it. So we have no photograph showing a big hole at the back of the head in any agreed upon fashion.
Now, was there evidence of the occipital bone being blasted out off of his head? I don't know if you want to, the Harper.
So you've asked me that question. The evidence, what evidence is there for the occipital bone being missing?
Mm-hmm.
There is some evidence that the occipital bone was missing. We have, as I mentioned before, the statement of the pathologists themselves in their official report, plus their sketch, which suggests that at least a portion of the occipital bone was missing. We have the eyewitness statements from Parkland in Dallas, and we have the eyewitness statements at Bethesda, all of which suggest that the occipital bone was missing, at least a part of it. In addition, there is other evidence. Some of that evidence comes from Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist. While at the autopsy, bone fragments were delivered into the autopsy room. These supposedly had been picked up in Dealey Plaza in Dallas that same day. And when Dr. Ebersol was being interviewed by the House Select Committee, he said that when these fragments came in, he immediately had an explanation for why there was a hole in the back of the head. And he interpreted these, at least one of these fragments, as being occipital bone. Now, you can debate whether he was right or wrong about whether it really was or was not occipital bone. But don't lose sight of the fact that Ebersol is a radiologist, and the only reason that he would even consider interpreting either any of these bones as occipital is because he already knew that some of the occipital bone was missing in the skull. And that had to be based not only on the x-rays, but also on his personal observations of the skull at the autopsy. So to me, that's very powerful evidence that some or all of the occipital bone was missing at the autopsy, based on that statement by Ebersol. In addition, several days later, another piece of bone was brought into the picture. This is called the Harper fragment, named after the medical student who discovered it. Harper took this fragment to, I believe it was his uncle, at a local Dallas hospital. Now, his uncle was a pathologist, it turned out, who examined the bone and took some very high-quality photographs of it. The bone was examined by at least one, if not a third, pathologist, and it was their totally concurrent opinion that this was occipital bone, based on a close examination. The bone itself has disappeared, but we still have the photographs of it left, which are quite good quality. This bone was not available to the pathologist, and they never examined it. So they never had it at the autopsy. They never had the opportunity to try to fit it into the skull. There is still debate about whether the pathologists in Dallas who saw this bone are correct. There is no consensus on this point. So all we have left now are the photographs. And the photographs are not nearly as good evidence as the bone itself for making this conclusion. My own analysis arrived at from a close examination of the x-rays, the photographs, is consistent with this bone being from the occiput. In fact, my optical density measurements were really important to me in this whole reconstruction process. With those measurements, I was able to determine where the bone was missing on the back of the head. Not totally, but to a good degree. I'm going to stop for a second to stop the noise here.
Be careful.
Oh, yes, thanks.
Okay.
Using just the optical density measurements, naked eye views of the skull, I was able to determine where the hole in the occipital bone was in the back of Kennedy's skull. And after I had done that, only after I had done that, did I bring the photographs of the Harper fragment into the scene and try to position it. And I was really stunned. It fit remarkably well into that area. It wasn't low in the occiput, it was high in the occiput. So my best guess is that the Harper fragment comes from the high occipital area. And the most amazing thing of all is that on one corner of the Harper fragment, there is some grayish discoloration. You can see it in the photographs today, and it has been confirmed as having been there in real life by the pathologist who saw it. And they interpreted this area as possible evidence of a lead-type bullet passing through just at that corner. And so when I went through this process without trying to force anything, it turns out that this grayish area is right exactly where the pathologist said that bullet entered from the right rear of the skull. And that to me was uncanny, because I hadn't been trying to reach that conclusion. I'd just been trying to determine from my measurements where the defect was in the skull, and then after I'd done that, tried to see if the Harper fragment would fit in there. It seemed to fit in there brilliantly well, and then furthermore, that grayish discoloration occurs just where the pathologist said the bullet entered. So that's very powerful evidence to me that the Harper fragment did indeed represent the upper occiput, and it actually contains on it evidence of the bullet that the pathologist described.
Great. Yeah. So, was there anything else? Okay. Did you have anything in mind in particular?
Yeah, the things we talked about before, we can review those again.
Okay. Let me just make sure that. Okay.
The pathologists themselves never described any direct evidence for a frontal headshot at the autopsy. It doesn't appear in their report, and in all the interviews since then, they have never provided us with any evidence, any objective evidence for a frontal headshot. They've stood by their story that there was one shot to the head and that it came from the right rear and it entered low in the occiput just above the hairline. But there is much other evidence that suggests that there was a shot to the head from the front. The eyewitness evidence is quite compelling on this point. Eyewitnesses from many points in Dealey Plaza describe sounds of rifle fire or gunfire coming from the front or the right front. Kennedy's movements in the limousine suggest that he was hit from the front. But there's more evidence than that. Several doctors who were present at Parkland Hospital in Dallas described a gunshot wound to the right temple or forehead of Kennedy. They describe it on the left side, though, and so this testimony has always been written off as just a gross blunder. But we also have the report now of Tom Robinson, who worked for Gawler's funeral home. Tom Robinson saw a small, several millimeter hole on the right side of the forehead or temple. It was probably right above the lateral orbit, right where the hairline is. He describes placing wax in there to fill that hole, and it's just the right size for a bullet hole. So my belief is that the doctors at Dallas probably did see a bullet hole consistent with that, and they simply confused left and right. And having made the mistake the first time, they no longer had the opportunity to look at the body to correct themselves, and so they were stuck with that. How likely is it that left and right get confused? It happens all the time in this case. I've done it repeatedly, even though I know very well which side things are on. Robert Blakey, the chief counsel for the House Select Committee, did it publicly on television and never corrected himself. Other well-known figures in this case have also confused left for right. So I think this hypothesis that the doctors confused left for right in Dallas is a very reasonable one. And they were very consistent about where they placed this hole other than left for right. If they had just said right side, they'd be right on target with Tom Robinson's actual report too. But there's even more to it than that. Charles Crenshaw, several years ago, appeared on Geraldo Rivera's program. And he was asked where the shot entered from the right front. And Crenshaw pointed right there again, same spot. But it's even more interesting than that. At the press conference, immediately after the assassination, the press conference that occurred at Parkland Hospital, we have a still existing photograph of the speaker addressing this question. And we have a photograph in our book, Assassination Science, of him pointing to the right forehead for the entrance of the bullet. He simply asked, where'd the bullet come in? And he points up here. He's a little low compared to where we think it should be, but that's not surprising. If you try to pinpoint a spot on your forehead without seeing where you're pointing, you're not certain to hit it. So there's an amazing amount of historical evidence, plus the funeral home personnel, who place a frontal shot here. But it's even more interesting than that. When I began looking at the lateral x-rays, another feature that caught my eye was what looks like a bullet trail going across the top of the head through here. And you can see those same bullet fragments on the frontal x-ray as well. And so the question was, what does that represent? Does that represent the shot from the rear, or does that represent a shot from the front, or some curious mixture? Well, the latter, a mixture, seems pretty unlikely that a bullet trail would be mimicked by two separate bullets traversing the same thing. So I think that's not very likely at all. It's possible there may be some small admixture, but the main bullet trail has to be due to one bullet. The interpretation of the House Select Committee on Assassinations was that this represented the posterior bullet. They came in pretty high on the back of the skull, near the colic area. And so they agreed by 4 inches with the pathologist who had placed it much lower. The reason that they placed it up there was because they saw this 6.5 millimeter object close to it, but not at the right spot. Actually, the separation between the 6.5 millimeter object and the trail is quite large. It's an inch or more in separation, so it really doesn't fit. Moreover, it doesn't even fit with the defect in the skull where they said the bullet entered. So we have 3 different sites on the back here that they're talking about. The lowest one is where the 6.5 millimeter object is seen. Then a centimeter above that is the site they selected for where the bullet actually entered. Then above that, further above that, is where the bullet trail is. So these things, none of them fit. And so I think it's reasonable to suggest that maybe there's another answer. Suppose the bullet came in from the front, then where would it have entered the skull? And that's actually quite easy to determine because we have 2 x-ray views, one from the side, one from the front. If that trail represents a bullet that came in from the front, well then it entered right here, at the hairline, very near the hairline, and just above the outside edge of the orbit. And that's consistent historically with what we've been told by all these eyewitnesses. So the x-rays match the eyewitness reports if you believe that this trail is from a frontal bullet. Now, another curious feature about this frontal shot is when this frontal shot could have occurred. Let's assume that it's from a frontal bullet. In the Zapruder film, at the famous frame 313, where you see the red halo surrounding Kennedy's head, Kennedy is bent quite far forward, and his head is turned slightly to the left. Where would a gunman be located in the front or right front with respect to Kennedy's skull? Well, he would be positioned slightly above him because the road at that point is lower than the surrounding knoll and the overpass. So the gunman would be above Kennedy's position. Shooting from above with the bullet coming in here would require a bullet trail going downward in the skull. That's the only way it would fit for any reasonable frontal bullet. Is that what we see on the x-ray? No, it's not. In fact, it's grossly inconsistent with what we see on the X-ray. If you position the X-ray in a nice seated, erect position, what you see is that the bullet trail goes upward as it goes to the back. So that's totally inconsistent with a frontal gunman at frame 313, the supposed headshot. What I've proposed, based on many, many other bits of evidence, is that there were two headshots. The first headshot would be the one the pathologist described, and it came in at the right rear, just above the hairline. The second shot came in after that. The question is, how much later? Many critics of the Warren Commission report still accept the proposal that was outlined in Josiah Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. Namely that after frame 313, the head moves abruptly backward and to the left. And that motion was attributed then to this frontal headshot. But it doesn't work, for the reason I've just given you. If Kennedy's head is forward and rotated to the left, then the bullet trail in the skull, seen on the skull X-rays, is in the wrong direction. So the second shot cannot come in immediately after the first shot. By immediately, I mean within 1, 2, 3 frames on the Zapruder film. That won't work. The only way you can reconcile the X-rays, the bullet trail in the X-rays, with the frontal shot is with a head position for Kennedy that is actually either erect or preferably even tilted back like this. Then a frontal shot coming in here will give the appearance of rising in the skull because of the head orientation. Only then will it work. So the question then is, where in the Zapruder film is Kennedy's head in that position? And that occurs at the end or near the end of the famous head snap. His head starts low with one headshot and then moves backward like this. And only as it's backward can the second headshot strike. Then that would be consistent with the bullet trail from the front. So, to summarize, if you believe that the bullet trail represents a frontal headshot, that shot cannot come instantly or nearly instantly after the first shot. It can't be bang bang. There has to be a slight separation in time, at the very least, between the first headshot and the second or frontal headshot. So that leaves us without an explanation for the head snap, though. If the second headshot came too late to force the head back, we have no explanation for what caused this. And if you believe in the X-rays, and you believe there was a second headshot, you are left with that major unanswered question, which we can come back to later.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's start with that. I don't know if you want to talk about when we first saw the Zapruder film.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what your initial reaction was, because you probably, much like everybody, took it as the truth.
Sure. I first saw the Zapruder film in the fall of 1975. This was at the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, where Luis Alvarez was explaining his view of the head snap, the famous backward jerk of Kennedy's head after the supposed single headshot. So Alvarez was giving this lecture at the lab there, and I happened to be on campus at the time, so I was curious to see what he had to say. And I went away from that lecture not at all convinced that the head snap was proof that there had been a frontal shot or was evidence of conspiracy. I don't know for sure if I was convinced so much by Alvarez's argument as by the things I saw in the film itself. And I basically put that aside for many years and did not return to that question again until 1992. And as I began looking at the data at that time, I realized that this was still a very big puzzle, because the eyewitnesses seemed to be describing something different from what we were seeing in the film. So many eyewitnesses had the impression the shots came from the front, and photographs taken immediately after the shooting show crowds gathering on the overpass to the right front also. So we had a real paradox here. The eyewitnesses appeared to be telling one story, and the medical record, especially the pathology report, appeared to be telling another story. So I began focusing on the Zapruder film probably in 1994-95, as I began to realize how important that evidence was. One thing that had always struck me in looking at the Zapruder film was how very quickly the evidence of blood and debris disappeared from the film. The most evidence is on frame 313, which is called the headshot, as if it were singular. And after that, it's very difficult to see evidence of any blood or tissue debris. There is probably very faint evidence on the frame after, perhaps on the second frame after, but it's very subtle, very hard to be sure of, and it's really only that one frame that stands out. Now, why did that surprise me? Well, it surprised me for several reasons. We have eyewitnesses who saw and felt blood and tissue debris hitting them, either directly, like the motorcyclemen to the left rear, hitting their face screens or their windshields. The driver of the Secret Service car immediately after the presidential limousine was struck on the arm by debris, his left arm sticking out of the windshield, out of the door, and his windshield was also struck. One of the motorcyclemen on the left rear said he was struck so hard that he thought it was a bullet. So this is no small matter. Other witnesses at the left side of the limousine described seeing bone fragments in the air, and we know bone fragments were subsequently found, at least 2 of them. So where is this evidence in the film? If you do a simple physics calculation and assume a given height, and it doesn't have to be very high, you can calculate how many frames this material should be in the air and presumably should be visible. And it's much longer than what we see in the film. Well, to make matters worse, I was able to get good quality prints from the Alvarez work. I obtained this through my friend Paul Hoke, who was a critic of Alvarez's work. Paul was a physics graduate student at that time at Berkeley. And Paul very kindly supplied me with those images and frames. And I could see that they persisted for many frames in the Alvarez experiments. What he did was shoot melons. And the melon debris was obvious in these frames for, I think, at least 6 frames, certainly many more than we saw in the Zapruder film of the assassination. And other experimenters have also repeated this kind of work in more recent years and have found that debris is visible from many frames. So there's this really big paradox between what we see in the Zapruder film and in these experimental reproductions. So that struck me as being really odd. I couldn't understand how we could suddenly lose all evidence of the debris in the air. The other thing that really struck me was the eyewitness evidence for the stopping of the limousine. There were many, many eyewitnesses who said the limousine stopped, or let's not quibble about words, it nearly stopped. And they were quite emphatic about that. It was just something that was taken for granted. There was no one who disagreed with that. In fact, if you look through the major news media at that time, you find the same statements reported. And if I may, I'd like to quote some of them, because they're so impressive. In UPI's 4 Days, which was published in early 1964, just months after the assassination, the driver describes one of the photographs there in the following manner. He says, in the right-hand picture, which is a photograph from the Muchmore movie film, the driver slams on the brakes and the police escort pulls up. And later in that same book, the author Merriman Smith adds this: the president's car, possibly as much as 150 to 200 yards ahead, seemed to falter briefly. Newsweek magazine, December 2nd, 1963, wrote, for a chaotic moment the motorcade ground to an uncertain halt. And Time magazine, November 29th, 1963, asserted there was a shocking momentary stillness, a frozen tableau. In another book written by Trask, entitled Pictures of the Pain, he quotes Bobby Hargis, who was a motorcycleman on the left rear, as saying the following: "I felt blood hit me in the face, and the presidential car stopped immediately after that and stayed stopped for about half a second, and then took off at a high rate of speed." Even Gerald Posner, an ardent supporter of the Warren Commission and surely a supporter of film authenticity, states the following in his book, Case Closed. Incredibly, Greer, who is the driver of the presidential limousine, sensing that something was wrong in the back of the car, slowed the vehicle almost to a standstill. It would be interesting to ask Posner to point to that moment in the Zapruder film, because none of us can see it. So we have these amazing historical reports that the vehicle slowed dramatically, or stopped, as Hargis said very briefly. Yet when one looks at the Zapruder film, that moment is anything but obvious. So that struck me as being a startling discrepancy. So along with the Alvarez experiments and the eyewitness statements, I started taking seriously for the first time the possibility that the film had been altered. And once I began looking at that possibility, I realized that there were many other questions which still remained unanswered that might be addressed if the film indeed had been altered. And one of these was the famous head snap, the backward movement of Kennedy's head after frame 313, which is supposedly the moment of the single headshot. All the explanations that had been offered for this seemed to me grossly unsatisfactory. The frontal bullet really doesn't work. And the reason the frontal bullet doesn't work is manifold. If the frontal bullet came in immediately after 313, it's grossly inconsistent with the X-rays. But there's a problem with the frontal bullet coming in later, because then it's too late to produce the head snap. So either it comes in early enough to produce the head snap, in which case it's grossly inconsistent with the X-rays, or it comes in later, which fits with other evidence, but it's too late to produce the head snap. But there's another major reason why a frontal bullet won't work, and that has to do with basic physics. This bullet coming in from the front and producing the head snap has to do an awful lot of work. That requires a lot of energy. It has to propel backward Kennedy's head at a pretty good clip. This movement is very rapid in the film. It also has to move the upper torso backward. So all of that portion of the body has to be given a great deal of energy. But it's even more than that. You remember, Kennedy was leaning forward at 313. During that head snap, his whole body moves upward in the gravitational field. His head moves upward. A great deal of energy is required to move that much mass upward against gravity. The ITEC Corporation first did this calculation, and their conclusion was that the energy required both to elevate Kennedy's head and upper body against gravity and to impart all the kinetic energy to the same part of his body was way more than any reasonable bullet could possibly do. And I've worked through that calculation. I've modified some of their parameters to ones that I thought were more realistic. And I still agree with their conclusion. I don't see how a single bullet is able to do all of that. So I think this explanation of a frontal bullet just is not adequate to the task. The only other reasonable explanation that's been offered for the head snap is the so-called neuromuscular reaction. That is, when the major nerves in the brain are interrupted, there is a neuromuscular reaction that forces the head to go dramatically backward. This proposal was first entered into the record officially during the House committee hearings in the late 70s, not by anyone from the neurosciences who would be the appropriate expert, but rather by someone who had observed the shooting of goats in the head. And this explanation was very popular with the committee because they were searching around for some explanation other than a frontal bullet. And so it was entered into the record as a possible explanation. But there has never been any good documentation for this at all. As I said, no expert from the neurosciences of any kind has ever given any support to this. And if you look at the neurosciences literature, you find instead evidence to the contrary. This kind of a reaction to shooting should not lead to a directional movement of the body in any direction. The movements instead are chaotic, they're disorganized. There was a wonderful study done of patients who were near terminal, and the data on these patients too did not show this kind of rigidity that's required. To the contrary, these patients were more relaxed because their neural connections had been severed. So even that study doesn't support it. The timing for this is all wrong. It happens too quickly. It happens almost within the blink of an eye, which is almost unheard of for human reactions. So we probably belabored that long enough. I don't think that any serious appropriate expert can accept that explanation. So the other one is the frontal bullet shot, and that one doesn't work either. And that's what we're left with. But the other possibility is this. If the film was altered such that frames were systematically cut out, then the action would be speeded up. If every frame was cut out, then the action would be speeded up by a factor of 2. If 2 frames out of every 3 were eliminated in this portion, then the action would be speeded up by a factor of 3. And I suspect that that's what has happened. And that may also explain why we don't see debris in the air, because the frames immediately after that showed it are no longer there. There's actually historical support for this. Within a week or so after the assassination, a survey was made in Dealey Plaza to try to reproduce the events of the assassination. And the surveyors, several of them, held in their hands still frames of the Zapruder film, and they saw tissue debris or bone debris in the air in multiple frames. They're quite insistent on that, and they're describing these as large fragments, easily visible, not just fantasized. So we have their support for this too. So my conclusion today is still it's very possible that frames were cut out in a selective, systematic manner to eliminate this evidence for a frontal shot. Because if the Zapruder film were to show tissue debris in the air going to the posterior, and mainly to the posterior, that would be very powerful evidence of a shot from the front. And that's still what the eyewitness record shows. So if that were indeed the case, then it would be reasonable for anybody wanting to support the Oswald did it thesis to try to remove those frames, and you'd be left with action that was speeded up by quite a lot. Now there's more evidence for this position as well. There's a fellow named Schwartz who was the business partner with Zapruder, who saw the film, the original film, many times that weekend. And what he describes from his memory is that after Kennedy went forward, Jackie turned to him and slowly pushed him back up, apparently so that she could look at his face to see if he was responding, to see what had happened. But you don't see that in the Zapruder film today. That's not there. So my guess is that this really is what happened, that in real life, Jackie did lean over, looked at him, and slowly pushed him back up. And that when the film was edited, with frames being taken out, as described, this whole action is turned into a head snap. And it was precipitated not by anything except Jackie slowly pushing him back up. So what was a natural human movement in the film now looks like a jerk or a head snap. And that all fits if frames were selectively removed. Let's take a break there for a minute so I can gather my thoughts.
All right.
There is one more explanation for the...
One more thing too.
Oh, yeah.
Make sure you try to keep your focus this way.
Yeah, towards you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Eyes sometimes tend to...
Go ahead and signal me if I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
Give me
just
some
a natural
finger
thing
signals.
to just have a camera and to
Yeah, it is.
wanna look
So
at
you
it.
go ahead and signal me when I'm not doing that.
Okay. But I don't want to interrupt your flow of
No, just
conversation.
do that. Okay. There is one more explanation that has been proposed for the head snap. And Alvarez was an earlier supporter for this idea of a jet effect, although he himself did not originate it. But in his paper, he supported this notion of a jet effect, which goes as follows. A shot comes in from the rear of the head, and as a result, when the bullet exits, opens up a hole somewhere in the front of the head. A great deal of brain tissue, blood, comes out the front, producing a jet effect. So much comes out this way that it pushes the head backward. And that's the so-called jet effect. And Alvarez apparently believed that this was a possible explanation for what is seen in the Zapruder film. And other people have been supporters of that perspective as well. But there are some very powerful arguments against it, as follows. Experiments have been done with human skulls filled with gelatin-like material. The Edgewood Army Arsenal, for example, shot 10 human skulls in this fashion, and none of them went backward. None of them toward the shooter. In addition, Doug DeSales and Art Snyder independently have done more melon shooting experiments. And in their experiments, they were never able to show any significant similarity to a head snap. On a few of their melons, the skulls moved very slowly to the backward direction toward the shooter, but very inconsistently and only very slightly. So there's really very little experimental support for the jet effect, but there's even more arguments against it. In order to produce the head snap that's so obvious and almost violent in the Zapruder film, a great deal of tissue needs to be pushed out in a highly directional fashion toward the front of the right front. And you can calculate how much brain tissue has to come out at what speed, and you can look at the mass of Kennedy's brain that was left after this. And it's inconsistent. If you really believe the autopsy report, which said that the brain weighed about 1,500 grams after all of this happened, that's by itself quite extraordinary, because most human brains aren't that big before any trauma. If you believe that, then there's no way that the jet effect can happen, because the brain certainly couldn't have started at 2,000 grams, which is way above normal. But even if you believe that a good deal of the brain had been missing at the end of the autopsy and had been blown out during the murder, there's still not enough there, as one can calculate. Even if you take the 2/3 of the right cerebrum that Hume said was missing, and you point it all out toward the front, you still have trouble getting enough for the jet effect. It takes an enormous amount of mass, and it has to come out in a highly directional fashion in order to even have hope of a jet effect. And we have all these eyewitnesses at the rear, the left rear, who felt a great deal of momentum and energy striking them as a result of this debris coming out. Some of it did come out toward the front. There were bits and fragments on the Connollys. We know that some of it came out the front. But in order for the jet effect to work, it has to be highly directional, almost all of it coming out toward the front. And where is it going to come out? If you look at the skull X-ray, it can't come out in this area. The bone is intact here, so it can't possibly come out here. It might possibly have come out the top of the skull or the high forehead, but the hole on the head is really more on the top and the back. So the X-rays, the autopsy findings, are inconsistent with the notion of a jet effect. It just doesn't fit. The experimental evidence that I've mentioned from the Edgewood Army Arsenal, the independent experiments with melons, they don't work either. So we'll come back to the question, why did Alvarez believe in the jet effect? Well, because he had been able to demonstrate that with melons, but he had used soft-nosed ammunition. That's why it worked in the melons. If he used a 6.5 millimeter metal-jacketed Mantik rifle, there's virtually no jet effect. And that's the bullet that the Warren Commission proposed for this job. So in order to get a jet effect, you have to use a bullet that doesn't fit with the whole Warren Commission scenario. So I think it's reasonable to conclude, and there's other evidence in support of this that I haven't mentioned, that the jet effect in this particular case, using a 6.5 millimeter metal-jacketed Mantik bullet simply does not work. So the jet effect is not a reasonable explanation for this either. And so if you conclude that this doesn't work, and the neuromuscular reaction doesn't work, and the frontal bullet doesn't work, we are left with no explanation for the most dramatic movement in the Zapruder film, the head snap. No explanation. And that's one reason that I think that film alteration must be considered seriously.
Great. I didn't even know all about a lot of those things. I'll just make sure of that. Okay. All right, I'm ready.
Another explanation for the head snap, I'll start over.
Okay.
Another explanation for the head snap has been the so-called jet effect. This was supported early on by Alvarez, although he himself did not initiate it. And the idea is as follows. If a bullet enters the rear of the head and explodes out the front of the head, then a large mass of brain and blood debris and bone shoots out the front. This is the so-called jet. And this is supposedly so powerful going forward that it pushes the head backward as a reaction. Now, what are the arguments in favor of this? Latimer did shooting experiments with skulls in which he said he saw this happen in 12 skulls. But he's the only individual who's ever seen this happen. And there's a problem with Alvarez's experiments because he placed his skulls on a ladder, and the ladder is another interaction in the whole experiment, which makes this very difficult to interpret. When shooting experiments were done with human skulls filled with gelatin at the Edgewood Army Arsenal, 10 skulls in a row did not show the jet effect. Instead, they went forward. So we have zero support there for the jet effect. In addition, melon shooting experiments, like those of Alvarez, have been done independently now by two additional individuals, Doug DeSales and by Art Snyder. And in these melon experiments, there is virtually no evidence for a jet effect. You know, the best that they can get is a faint movement backward on a few melons, but nothing at all that resembles the rapid backward movement of Kennedy's head. So experimentally, there is virtually no support for it. As far as the data in the Kennedy case itself, there is also virtually no support. In order to get such a fast backward and to the left movement of Kennedy's head, virtually all of the missing brain, bone, and blood has to come out in one direction. It should come out forward and maybe slightly to the right. In order to do that, though, it has to leave this portion of the head, the lower forehead, the face, and we know that it didn't do that, and we know it because we can see on the x-rays that the bone is all there. It's only in the high forehead that the bone is absent, and then going posteriorly it's also absent. So the x-rays are not consistent with such a jet effect. It simply doesn't work. Moreover, the reported size of the brain in the official autopsy is 1,500 grams, which is really above normal for an intact brain. In this case, though, we know the brain was not intact. James Humes, the pathologist, said that 2/3 of the right cerebrum was missing. So we can estimate, based on that, that there might be 400 grams of brain tissue available for the jet effect, plus a few grams from bone and blood. But this is not likely to do the job, because it all has to come out in a forward direction, not upward, but forward. It all has to come out in that direction in order to have any hope of working for the jet effect. And we know that's not what happened. We know that because we have many eyewitnesses who either saw tissue and bones coming out the rear of the head or were struck by it. The driver of the follow-up car was struck on the elbow, his limousine was splattered, the motorcycle one on the left rear was hit, and his windshield was splattered, and other witnesses saw bone debris coming out to the rear, so we know this was not directional. Alvarez never takes this evidence into account. He never discusses the size of the brain or how much tissue might have been available for this. That's totally outside the range of his discussion. So none of the experimental work on melons or on human skulls supports the jet effect. The eyewitness evidence doesn't support a highly directional movement of tissue in the Kennedy case. And here's yet another piece of evidence. In 1992, China shot 6 prisoners, and the news media caught this event on video camera. These prisoners were kneeling, and they were shot from behind. at fairly close range, about a foot or so distance, with a rifle that was similar, SKS type rifle, that was similar to the rifle that Oswald supposedly used. And metal jacketed bullets were used in this case. And in none of these 6 cases was there any head snap seen. Instead, the prisoners just went forward. The other point that should be made is that in the melon shooting experiments, a jet effect was seen if hunting type ammunition was used. Hunting type ammunition has a soft nose rather than a metal jacket. And when such ammunition was used, a jet effect could be seen in the melon cases. But this does not fit with the Warren Commission report, which insisted that Kennedy was shot with a metal jacketed bullet like the Mannlicher Carcano. So you can either believe the Warren report, in which case there's no support for the jet effect, or if you believe the jet effect, then you have to assume that hunting type ammunition was used, and that's not what Oswald used. So basically those are your choices if you want to work with the jet effect. So in summary, the jet effect cannot explain the head snap well, a frontal bullet cannot explain it well, the neuromuscular reaction does not explain it well, and those are the only 3 serious proposals that we've ever had to explain the head snap. And so partly based on the failure of those 3, I also feel that the proposal of alteration of the Zapruder film should be taken seriously, because if 2 out of every 3 or 3 out of every 4 frames were removed, then this backward movement of Kennedy is accelerated, and the backward movement was probably caused simply by Jackie lifting Kennedy up at a reasonably slow pace to look into his eyes. And that's exactly what Schwartz says he saw on the Zapruder film that weekend. He says that Jackie lifted him up as if she were looking into his face and asking what's wrong. So we have that eyewitness support for exactly that event.
Okay.
Question on which my attention was focused as I began looking at the Zapruder film issues was the movement of Kennedy's head with the headshots. And I say headshots plural because I believe that there were 2 rather than the Warren Commission's scenario of 1. In the Zapruder film, we see the single headshot occurring at frame 313. And after that shot, you see the head snap. His head moves rapidly to the rear, and then he comes forward again and falls into Jackie's lap. But as I was looking at this issue and thinking about it, it seemed that the eyewitnesses and the x-rays too were telling us that there were 2 headshots, not just 1. And it occurred to me at that moment that perhaps if I analyzed the eyewitness testimony carefully, I might be able to discriminate between the first headshot and the second headshot. And I had never seen that type of analysis done on this question before, to my great amazement. And this was only a few years ago. And as I began looking at that late one evening, I was really struck by how consistent the witnesses were. It seemed to me that they were telling us about 2 different headshots. Some witnesses saw only the first, some only the second, but there were a set of witnesses who seemed to have been aware of 2 separate events to the head. And I'd like to quote some witnesses that support that proposal. And this proposal centers around the movement of Kennedy's body in particular, which is different from what we see in the current film. And I'll quote a number of witnesses here and what they said. Alt. Following the first shot, Kennedy appeared to raise up in his seat. Now that's strange right away, because if you believe the first shot struck Kennedy in the back and caused him to lean forward with his arms up as we see in the film, that's contrary to what he's saying. He said that after the first shot, Kennedy appeared to raise up in his seat. And after the second shot, the president slumped into his seat. And you're going to see this kind of statement recur again and again. Kennedy fell forward. Kennedy fell forward. Hargis, he was the motorcycleman on the left. I heard the first shot. The president bent over. Now that's consistent with what we see in the film. Kennedy's arms coming up and his body leaning forward. Then Hargis goes on. Connolly turned around. It looked like the president was bending over to hear what he had to say. It's probably this position still. When JFK straightened back up in the car, so he's going from this position to now a straight up position. And he says, when JFK straightened back up in the car, his head exploded. When he's erect, this is me talking now, when he's erect, that's when the head exploded. That's not what we see in the Zapruder film. What you see in the Zapruder film is Kennedy leaning forward. It's in this position that his head explodes. This witness, Hargis, the motorcycleman at the left rear, says he saw Kennedy doing this, which we see in the film. Then he saw something that's not in the film. He saw Kennedy going back erect, and while erect, then the head explodes. And that's consistent with what we see on the X-rays in a shot from the front, as I was discussing before. Amazingly consistent. Another witness, Hickey, Secret Service man. He was slumped forward and to his left. Here we go again. We see that in the film. And was straightening up to an almost erect sitting position. It's the same story that Hargis tells us. He sees Kennedy moving erect after being forward, moving erect. They both see him moving erect. Neither of them describe what we see in the Zapruder film. They're both contradicting the Zapruder film. When he was sitting erect, I heard two reports. The last shot made him fall forward and to his left again. In other words, this witness saw Kennedy move forward 2 times. The first time, of course, is when his arms are up like this and he's tilted forward. They both describe that. But then they both go on to describe his moving erect, and while erect, he gets hit in the head again, and he falls forward a second time, and no more shots are heard. That's not what we see in the film. Another witness, Kinney, Secret Service. The first shot was fired, and it appeared that he had been shot because he slumped to the left. Here we go again. All three describing this. But what happens next? This is what he says. And it appeared that he had been shot because he slumped to the left. I already said that. Immediately, he sat up again. This is the 3rd time we've heard this statement now. He sat up again. We don't see that in the film. Kennedy is sitting up again. I think this is where Jackie is moving him back up to look at him. At this time, Clint Hill jumped off and ran to the president's car. And as this event is happening, he says, at this time the second shot was fired. Kennedy is erect, and it's while he's erect that the second shot is fired. Apparently this witness hears only 2. But anyway, he describes Kennedy as being erect, and while erect, that's when he hears another shot. We see none of this in the film. Let's go on. Clint Hill is a particularly powerful witness who disagrees with the Zapruder film. Here is Jack Reedy, another Secret Service agent, who describes the movement of Clint Hill. And he says this, I remember Clint Hill attempting to climb onto the president's car. This is way after frame 313. We have to keep that in mind. All these events now have occurred after the supposed single headshot at 313. This is way later. It was at this moment that I heard a second report. And it appeared that the president's head split open with a muffled exploding sound. Now here's what Clint Hill says. The sound came from my right rear, and I immediately moved my head in that direction. As I did so, I saw the president hunch forward. This is probably what we see in the film again. And then slumped to his left, as we see in the film. I jumped from the follow-up car and I ran. I heard a second firecracker noise, but it had a different sound, like the sound of shooting a revolver into something hard. I saw the president slump more to his left. And then, to really clarify what Clint Hill saw, we need this next statement. I jumped from the car and ran. Just about as I reached it, meaning the car, there was another sound. Now remember, this is way after 313 in the so-called single headshot. All these events are much later. Just as I reached it, there was another sound. It seemed to have some kind of echo. I put my right foot on the left rear step, and I had a hand gripped. And when the car lurched forward, I lost my footing and I had to run 3 or 4 more steps before I could get back up in the car. Between the time I originally grabbed the handhold and until I was up on the car, the second noise that I heard had removed a portion of the president's head and he had slumped noticeably to his left. All of this is way after 3:13, the supposed single headshot. During the interval between the first headshot at 3:13, which I believe happened and was shot from the right rear, after that happened, there was a long enough interval for Clint Hill to leave the limousine, leave his own car, run up to the limousine, and while there, trying to get out, then he heard another shot, and this one he saw take off part of the head. It's way after 3:13. And it's consistent with the statements I read you from the other witnesses who saw Kennedy first go forward to the left one time, but then come back erect. We don't see that movement in the film. And while erect, he gets hit, and the top of his head comes off. Clint Hill doesn't describe all that because he's busy running, but he does describe events that happen in a time interval that's consistent with that. And as I've said before, the x-rays are such powerful evidence as well. That bullet trail across the top of the head are such powerful evidence that the second headshot, if you believe in it, could not have happened right after the first. It had to be later, while Kennedy was erect. And that's what all the witnesses are telling us. The problem with that, though, is that we don't see that in the film. We do not see Kennedy coming back up like this to be erect and struck by the frontal bullet. All we see in the film is his leaning forward, and then all of a sudden he's moving backward and we see the halo around his head. That's all there is. So our best speculation is that the evidence for the second headshot has been removed from the film. Obviously, if there was evidence in the Zapruder film for 2 headshots, plus all the other shots, it would require at least 4, if not more shots. Too many for Oswald to do this alone. So anyone who wants to support the thesis that Oswald did this by himself absolutely must remove this evidence for the second headshot. Besides, the second headshot probably shows evidence for a shot from the front, which is also not acceptable to the Warren Commission view. So for multiple reasons, the evidence of that second shot just has to be taken out. But there is more eyewitness evidence that supports this idea that there were 2 spatially, temporally separated headshots. Focus on one additional piece of information, the halo of debris that came out of the head, which a lot of people report seeing. There's no question, I think, that the consistency of the eyewitnesses strongly supports their seeing blood and tissue coming out of the head. The question, though, is when did this happen? Did this happen with the first headshot or the second headshot? In the film, in the Zapruder film, there's only one shot at 3:13. That's when it's seen. But if you look at the eyewitness statements carefully, they see it happening with the second headshot, not the first. And here's some evidence for that. Gene Hill, Mary Moorman, were looking right at the president at frame 3:13. How do we know that? Well, we see them doing it right in the Zapruder film. And we have their statements as well that they were doing it. But neither of them saw a blood-type halo coming from Kennedy's head at 3:13. The Newmans were on the right side of the limousine, opposite from Gene Hill and Mary Moorman. They don't describe a halo. They did see some bleeding, some blood, but they don't describe this halo-type effect. In fact, I don't think you can find any eyewitnesses that you can identify as looking at the limousine at that moment who describe a halo. But you can find eyewitnesses who describe looking at the president after that shot, after that location in the street, who did see a halo. They describe it as either further down the street, in their own words, or they describe it as being associated with the last shot, consistent with Clint Hill climbing up on the limo. And as you think about this, you realize, this really makes sense. Because in those 6 prisoners who were shot in China, no one described a halo. In fact, how would you get enough blood to produce a halo unless there had been ample time for blood to accumulate in a cavity inside the brain, enough blood to produce such a halo? And if there was a time interval of 1 or several seconds between the first and second headshot, then there would be time for blood to accumulate inside the skull so that when the second and last headshot hit, all this blood would be available to be pushed out at one time. You have a lot more blood available, and therefore you should expect or shouldn't be surprised to see a blood-type halo. So that's my conclusion, that the first headshot did not produce a halo, but the second one farther down the street did, because blood had a chance to accumulate in a pretty big area, a pretty big volume inside the skull at that time. And that's really what the eyewitnesses are consistently telling us. So we don't see that in the Zapruder film. We don't see two headshots. We see a blood halo with the first shot. It was probably moved photographically from the second shot to the first shot. And we don't see Kennedy rising up again in his seat, like the witnesses consistently tell us. That's gone from the film. We don't see tissue debris going out the back of the head, like the surveyors saw on those early prints, and like witnesses saw. That's all gone from the film. So those are additional reasons for questioning the authenticity of the film.
Should we talk about the blob?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a whole lot of astute things to say about the blob, except that it looks suspicious. I don't have anything quantitative to say. Did you talk to Harry about that?
I don't know how much he mentioned. He did mention it a little bit.
Yeah.
Was it you that said that it doesn't represent any anatomical structure, that blob?
Well, I think it probably doesn't.
Did you mention, I'm not sure, the fact that, I think you did sort of, the fact that nobody's witnessed this backward head movement?
I haven't specifically said that today, but that's correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We can add that at this point if you like.
Okay, why not?
Okay. Are we still on?
Yeah,
okay.
We're still rolling.
As I focused on the head snap, I realized suddenly at one point that I couldn't remember any witnesses who were actually in Dealey Plaza who made a point of describing that head snap. And that struck me as odd, and as I looked for such evidence further, I never really found it. So as far as I know to this date, no one who was actually in Dealey Plaza who saw the assassination has described that sudden backward jerking movement of Kennedy's head. And anyone who watches the film nowadays, you know, they're quite struck by that movement. Another paradox, that the actual witnesses didn't describe that, whereas viewers of the contemporary film are often quite struck by that. And so that seemed to me another piece of evidence that the Zapruder film had been altered, that there really was no head snap in real life, in real time at the assassination, but that it had been produced artificially in the film. The other